Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexis Alvarez. I'm the Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services. I'm really excited to be here with you all today for this very important training, training that is very dear to my heart, as a woman, as a liberal, as somebody that does not like my rights to be messed with in any way. Um, so welcome to Post Roe, What's Next for Floridians Seeking Reproductive Health Care. Thank you all for carving out the time to be here to learn and be here in community with us. And we're going to get started. So before we move into introductions, just some brief housekeeping announcements. This training was approved for CLE credit. I will drop that CLE code into the chat and I will announce it at the end. So please be patient, but you'll get it at the end. And also you will receive an email from Zoom within 24 hours with a copy of the recording of this session and the CLE information. If you don't receive that in your inbox, you can always reach out to me. Once I'm done talking, I'll drop my email into the chat. So other housekeeping announcement, questions and answers. Please feel free to drop your questions into the chat or the Q&A. I will be monitoring those questions and they will be addressed at the end, given our speakers' time commitments and how long they can stay on. But we'll get to your questions. So please don't be shy. Please drop them in. This is your chance to have to be a part of this conversation and communicate. And finally, big shout out to our co-sponsors. This training is co-sponsored by the Center for Reproductive Rights and Planned Parenthood of Southwest and Central Florida, two incredible organizations doing work that I wish I was strong enough to do every single day. So without further ado, thank you again for joining us with this conversation. We look forward to discussing, the shifting landscape, the justice rights in Florida, and the barriers that we're experiencing and identifying those to protect access now that our federal guarantee has been removed. And with that, I will turn it over to Ellie, our moderator here today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ellie Levesque. My pronouns are she, they. I am the Government Relations Fellow for Planned Parenthood of Southwest and Central Florida, and I am a 1L at the University of the District of Columbia, David A. Clark School of Law. The fundamental right to make decisions about our bodies, lives, and futures is essential to the pursuit of racial, reproductive, and economic justice. While we continue this important work, we have to pursue an advocacy framework that recognizes reproductive health, rights, and justice. Can you all identify and clarify the three key reproductive advocacy frameworks and how they work together to help us achieve reproductive freedom and liberation for all?
Sure, I'm happy to kick it off. Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline Sacerdote, she, her, hers. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm a staff attorney at the Center for Reproductive Rights, which for those who aren't familiar, is a global nonprofit organization working to make reproductive rights a human right here in the US and also across the globe. Since the center's founding in 1992, we've been involved in impact litigation, policy, and advocacy work across 5 different continents. And our mission is to use the power of law to advance reproductive rights as fundamental human rights around the world. I've been at the center about 6 years now as part of the US litigation team. We litigate in state and federal courts against abortion restrictions, including cases you may have heard of, such as Dobbs, which I'm sure everyone knows all too well, is the case in which the US Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. We also litigated the challenge to Texas's SB 8, which is otherwise known as the vigilante 6-week abortion ban that went up to the Supreme Court last year. And we also litigated the 2020 June Medical and 2016 Whole Women's Health Supreme Court cases. I'm also part of the team challenging Florida's HB 5, which is the 15-week ban that was passed this past legislative session. And as someone born and raised in Florida, I'm particularly excited to be here today and to be part of that team challenging Florida's ban. So we'll talk more about that case later on in the discussion, but now that I've said reproductive rights probably about 10 times already, I can go ahead and define how I understand it. So I think of reproductive rights as the legal aspect of reproductive movements or of reproductive advocacy frameworks. So it's the legal right to reproductive health and services and enforcement of those rights. And the other panelists will define reproductive justice and reproductive health, but I think it's worth saying that I think of all of these pieces working together. So as a reproductive rights litigator, I work with and strive to be an ally with reproductive justice groups, but I'm not myself an RJ advocate. But I think all of these pieces are interconnected, and reproductive rights are necessary, but certainly not sufficient. So I'll pass it to my other panelists.
Hi everyone, I will go next. My name is Stephanie Lorraine, pronouns she, her, Asia. I'm the executive director of Florida Access Network. We are a reproductive justice organization that provides abortion access for Floridians and Floridians at heart and advocates for sexual health and liberation for everybody through education, resources, and community. I am a person who's had multiple abortions, talk about my abortions frequently, and obviously this issue is really important to us. So I'm happy to be here today with y'all to address reproductive health next. So I am a social worker, so I'm not a medical clinical professional. So I will give that caveat. However, in terms of the reproductive health framework, reproductive health is that direct service delivery to address an individual's reproductive needs. That means providing birth support. That means providing direct abortion access, contraception support, all of those things. Specifically, Florida Access Network supports in making abortion access more accessible, since just because reproductive health services exist doesn't mean that they are accessible, especially to folks who are most marginalized, who lived in communities that don't have resources in general. So I will go ahead and pass it to my next panelist to introduce themselves and to talk about reproductive justice.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. I am Elise Powell. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst at the National Birth Equity Collaborative, or NBEC, coming to you from Washington, D.C. NBEC was founded almost 7 years ago by Dr. Joya Crear-Perry, who is a Black OBGYN and general health equity rock star. NBEC's mission is to create transnational solutions that optimize Black maternal, infant, sexual, and reproductive well-being and shift systems, culture, and culture through training, research, policy, advocacy, and community-centered collaboration so that all Black mamas, their babies, and their villages can thrive. And I joined NBEC's policy shop in early 2021. We primarily focus on maternal infant health. However, we are a reproductive justice org, so we really cover an expansive range of issues from environmental justice to domestic violence to infertility. And of course, recently, we've been doing a lot of work on the intersections of abortion and maternal health, which is why our great friends at the Center for Reproductive Rights invited us to be on this panel. So thank you all for having me. And I will round out the first question with reproductive justice, which is defined as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And this term was coined in 1994 by a group of Black women activists who were not seeing their needs met or themselves reflected and the reproductive rights agenda of second wave feminism. And so by adopting this human rights and social justice and reproductive rights tenets, they created this transformational and grassroots-based movement for social change. And this is the framework that NBEC uses to approach our policy and programmatic work. It requires a robust analysis of the power structures at play. It requires acknowledging that Black and Brown folks and women are subject to intersecting oppression, our race, our gender, our class, the neighborhoods we grow up in, our jobs, our access to healthcare, and the criminal legal system all work together to create the systems of oppression that we live in. And for RJ experts in the field of maternal health specifically, approaching this work without using this lens of reproductive justice is an exercise in futility. So with that, I will pass it back to Ellie.
Thank you all so much for your valuable knowledge for that first topic of discussion. Caroline, can you provide a comprehensive legal overview of the Dobbs decision and any post-Roe litigation that's on the way?
Sure. I will try to keep it relatively brief. But, first off, I think it's important to acknowledge, again, that we're really in a pivotal moment in the fight for reproductive rights and bodily autonomy. And I think, it's important to situate Dobbs again and again. So to reiterate that, for nearly 50 years, Roe versus Wade was the law of the land. In 1973, the promise of Roe was that it would give people freedom to decide for themselves when and whether to bear children. But as Elise and Stephanie have just explained very clearly already, that promise was never realized for so many people, and Roe was never enough. Even while that decision was in place, not a day went by without someone attempting to whittle away that right to abortion, making it harder for people to access care in too many states, making it hard for providers to provide the care that patients want, and keeping lawyers and other advocates all too busy defending against unconstitutional bans and restrictions. But even so, Roe did stand for the principle that abortion is a fundamental right protected by the 14th Amendment, rights to privacy and liberty. And 20 years after Roe in 1992, the US Supreme Court in Casey reaffirmed that right, holding that restrictions on abortion were subject to the undue burden standard and reaffirming that abortion cannot be banned prior to viability. And Casey was precedent on precedent. After Casey, there were more recent cases, the whole women's health and medical cases that I mentioned, affirming that there remains a fundamental right to abortion in the federal Constitution. And of course came Dobbs, which challenged Mississippi's ban on abortion after 15 weeks, which is a full 2 months prior to viability, the line set by SCOTUS. The center represented Jackson Women's Health Organization, which was the last remaining abortion clinic in Mississippi. As the case was moving through the courts, the ban was easily struck down as unconstitutional by the district court. And what I have to add is a beautifully written opinion, which I highly recommend reading. And the ban was also struck down by the Fifth Circuit. Then Mississippi saw cert from the Supreme Court, and for 11 months, the Supreme Court contemplated whether to take the case. When the court granted cert, we knew we were potentially looking at a really bad outcome. In its brief, the state of Mississippi boldly asked the court to overturn Roe, and in other words, to allow states to say that there is no right to abortion. The center argued the case on December 1st of 2021, and we got the decision, of course, on June 24th. But as we all know, before that decision, on May 2nd, Politico reported that they had obtained a leaked draft opinion written by Justice Alito overturning Roe and Casey. And the final order of the court, the decision that came down on June 24th, really did track that leaked draft. In short, the Supreme Court held that there is no federal constitutional right to abortion. It explicitly overturned Roe and Casey, and it has permitted states to restrict or even ban abortion prior to viability. This opinion is basically the worst case scenario. There's no way to sugarcoat it. It's already having a devastating impact on patients across the country. And it, of course, implicates rights beyond abortion. Since Roe came from a thread of cases that implicate fundamental decisions about bodies, lives, families, including who we're intimate with, who we marry, and the use of contraception, Dobbs has huge implications for all of those rights as well. It represents a profound retrogression of a well-established and fundamental right. And I think it's important to say that we've seen the Supreme Court gut rights before. We saw them do that in Shelby County, gutting the enforcement mechanism of the Voting Rights Act. But this is the first time that the Supreme Court has explicitly taken away a recognized right completely. Bans on abortion as well as regulations are now subject to rational basis. So just a few quick things to highlight about the decision. Dobbs applies an extremely narrow approach to determining what liberty rights are guaranteed by the 14th Amendment based on whether the specific practice was, quote unquote, deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. The decision ignores the profound impact pregnancy has on people's bodies and lives, and just generally ignores pregnant people. And also the majority concludes that the court lacks the authority or the expertise to consider what abortion means for people's lives. And this is really key because what the court did is it ignored mountains of empirical evidence that were in the record that demonstrated, well, I should say record evidence from health experts, economists, and others demonstrating just how critical abortion has been to people's health, their lives, their future, and to advancing gender equality, including the ability to pursue an education, a profession, and economic security. So that's really heavy. Turning to post-Roe litigation, the fallout has really already been devastating. It's been chaotic. We've seen states that have gotten completely dark, meaning there's no abortion care being provided in the state. Conditions are really changing daily. So the center has a tool on our website called After Roe Fell, Abortion Laws by State, and it's tracking which bans are in effect. And we try to keep it as updated as possible, but there is a lot of ongoing litigation and new legislation. So, it changes, like I said, daily. Also last week, Guttmacher reported that in the 100 days since Dobbs, 66 clinics across 15 states have already been forced to stop providing. So like I said, it's already had a profound impact, and there's already a lot of litigation going on. So we and other litigating organizations like Planned Parenthood, the ACLU, the Lawyering Project, and others are working to fight a slew of laws. This includes trigger bans, which are laws that say if Roe or Casey are overturned, then abortion is banned in the state. I think about a dozen states had these trigger bans, and they're all sort of differ. They differ in their specific language and what exactly it takes to trigger these bans and have them go into effect. Like I said, there have been a number of lawsuits filed to challenge these. I'm on a case challenging Louisiana's 3 trigger bans. One passed in 2006, the other passed this past session and signed just 6 days before Dobbs was issued. In Louisiana, that case is actually still going strong. We got the 3 bans blocked 3 different times. So that was great. So clinics were able to continue providing care, but the bans are currently in effect for a lot of complicated legal reasons. We have a preliminary injunction, but that injunction is currently paused. And so we're still fighting that out, and that case is winding its way through the courts. There are also pre-Roe bans. So these are laws that have been on the books sometimes for over 100 years. And now are starting to go into effect, or states are trying to enforce them. And then there are also gestational bans, like the Florida 15-week ban. In terms of litigation, in the long term, I think there's still a lot of deep thinking that needs to be done. We're laying groundwork for next steps. We've always litigated in federal courts and also state courts. So I think we'll see more state court litigation and also the development of new legal theories and a lot of creative thinking. So with that, I'll turn it back to Ellie.
Thank you so much, Caroline. As you all know, there have been a number of recent attempts by the state of Florida to curtail access to reproductive health care, primarily abortion care. It is a state that ranks among one of the most conservative in the nation when it comes to accessing abortion, and one that has considerably high maternal mortality rates. The people hurt most by restrictions on abortion are those who already face barriers to accessing healthcare. This includes women, Black, Latino, Indigenous, and people of color, those with limited means, LGBTQIA+ people, immigrants, young people, and people with disabilities. At PPSWCF, we have seen patients coming to our health centers who are confused as to whether they can receive abortion care at all, or if they have come into our health centers too late due to the 15-week ban. Stephanie, can you discuss some of the unique barriers Florida residents are currently facing in accessing abortion care?
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. So I wanted to make sure to like create some context for folks to really better understand like where Floridians are, even with this, on top of this restrictive legislation. Florida has no Medicaid expansion, so folks who are most low income already struggle with accessing basic healthcare needs. Then you have a lack of social service infrastructure where folks, again, um, who have limited means don't have access to supportive services that could help them pay for some of their basic needs. Then we're experiencing in Florida a housing crisis, where in Orlando, we're seeing a 35% increase in rental costs just over the course of 1 year into the pandemic. Um, and then we have folks who just don't have emergency savings, right? And when we're thinking about paying for an abortion, you have an emergency expense that has a limited timeline, where now within the 15-week abortion ban, now someone has however that much time if they find out that they're pregnant to then be able to pay for an abortion. And the average cost of an abortion is about $600, right? So currently, like with that type of context, it's important to understand that then that's when resources like abortion funds or like the National Abortion Federation's hotline and abortion funds come into play, because they are able to help fill in the gaps that are left by a government that doesn't provide adequate support to its people, right? So in Florida, we're currently facing the 15-week abortion ban. We have a parental consent law on the books. And we are also dealing with a mandatory 24-hour waiting period, which each have its unique set of barriers. So starting with the parental involvement law, in 2020, we shifted from a parental notification to a parental consent state. Still, all that means now is that young people under the age of 18 are required to share and get a consent for their abortion decision from their parent. And consent looks like being present, right, for their appointment. And I want to say the majority of young people who get abortion care share this decision with their parents, right? So what this law actually did is make abortion more inaccessible for folks who can't safely share their abortion decision with their parents. Yes, so the only way to bypass parental consent is through a judicial bypass, or if the young person is married, if they are already a parent, and if they are emancipated legally from their parents. And a judicial bypass would then require the young person to seek legal counsel, which thankfully there are now a lot of resources. Ago, when I got my judicial bypass and I found information on Yahoo Answers, now we have some resources on the Floridians Reproductive Freedom website that walk young people through every single step that they need to do to access that judicial bypass, county by county. And that's the complication too. We have 67 counties and countless number of courthouses. In every single courthouse, it is different. There's not a uniform way to do this. So that is one of the barriers. And then I will also add that because there's not enough legal training or uniformity around what it even means to access a judicial bypass, of young people then have legal counsel that are uninformed and unable to provide them adequate legal support. So you have somebody like in the case in Lee County, I believe last year, where they didn't even need to get a judicial bypass. This young person was already a parent. That means, according to the statute, they didn't need to. So who in that moment required this young person to go through a judicial bypass? So that's also important to iterate, that there is just not enough information, and the people who do have the information, or the people who should be giving the information, aren't giving it, and that's courthouses. Um, so then moving to the 15-week ban. Obviously, a 15-week ban, force is a state-imposed timeline, not rooted in anything that is actually scientific, but instead imposes an arbitrary timeline on people who are pregnant, regardless of their circumstances. And also, so you then have, by the time people find out that they're pregnant, then starts this timeline of, okay, they have to, within however amount of time before the 15-week ban, find a way to make it to their appointment, pay for their appointment, identify and get childcare, because the majority of people who have abortions are already parents, find transportation, because if somebody is having an in-clinic abortion, they can't drive themselves home because they'll be a little woozy after. So then that's transportation. They may not want to share or can safely share the decision about wanting to have an abortion. So this is when, again, many like abortion funds, practical support organizations come into play, because they're able to help problem solve and create solutions for people who are seeking care in these moments. This also means that people who then fall out of that 15-week timeline then are forced to travel outside of the state if they can afford it, right? So even within that 15-week timeline frame in Florida, 70% of counties, only 70% of counties don't have abortion clinics, right? Florida does not have adequate public transportation or a high-speed rail. So dealing with that transportation piece of somebody needing to leave their community to access care is also inaccessible. We saw the way gas prices rose over the summer. And one of the biggest pieces of support that us as an abortion fund we provide is actually gas stipends and support, because people just can't get to their appointments. They may be even able to get a ride from someone, but when gas is $5 a gallon and minimum wage is $8, um, that's not gonna be enough. And people are, every day when they have the decision to try when they're trying to make the decision of how they're going to get access to their abortion, they are deciding whether they're going to keep a roof over their heads of them and their family, feeding their family, or access an abortion. Um, so forcing people to travel outside of their community also has that impact. And obviously, like, Florida previously was a haven state where people, especially in the South, in the surrounding states that had more restrictive abortion laws, were able to travel to Florida with more ease and not have to face some of these same types of barriers and restrictions. And with the 15-week ban, and also the mandatory waiting period that finally went into effect in April after years of litigation, changed that, right? So in dealing with the mandatory 24-hour waiting period, what does that mean? That's 2 appointments minimum. So you have a consultation appointment, an appointment for people who and the appointment to get an abortion. For somebody who is getting a medication abortion, it's 3 appointments because it's a third appointment to make sure that their abortion was completed. So because of the 15-week ban, because even considering the 15-week ban, people are still traveling from outside of the state to Florida for care. Appointment waiting times are I don't know what other way to say it, but wild, right? People may not be able to have like an appointment back to back where they can just, all right, they're done. Appointment times can be a week to 2 weeks apart. So that means on two separate occasions, people are having to make the same arrangements for childcare. That means lost wages. If there is no, family leave, um, that actually allows for abortion care. Many people don't have jobs like us that we're able to do something in the middle of the day and not have to run the risk of being fired. Um, so that obviously also turns into increased cost at an abortion clinic, because ultimately that is more time being spent from the clinic staff um, to be able to give people access to their abortion care. So I that covers like the main legal barriers and like what people are actually facing. And again, just want to reiterate that um, abortion restrictions create an added sense of urgency for folks who are facing whatever pregnancy decision they may want to face, whether it's continuing their pregnancy or um, wanting to end their pregnancy. In Florida, we don't have access to adequate, affordable health care. So even when people are forced to remain pregnant, which many people are being forced to remain pregnant because they're priced out, because they can't travel, because of all the things, you have people now in a state who may be forced to remain pregnant against their will and not have the resources to support those families that are now being created. Um, but we're hopeful that we can continue to fight these bans. I'm grateful to work at an organization that we're able to directly provide tangible support through like gas assistance, helping people travel, helping people navigate these barriers, and helping people pay for their abortion appointments. And that's my call to action. Donate to your local abortion fund, to your local practical support organization, because regardless of what's happening politically, whatever is happening in the courts, people are going to continue to get pregnant, and people are going to continue to want to end pregnancies, and we want to make sure that people have the resources to do that. So thank you for your time, everyone.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And thank you for particularly speaking to the judicial bypass in Florida. I remember years ago when we were fighting against that piece of legislation, and there was an organization that did research on whether or not local courts were prepared to assist young people with accessing a judicial bypass, and they were not. And, I'm so glad that Floridians for Reproductive Freedom have that amazing website now with providing all those resources as to, the exact process of a judicial bypass. And you're absolutely right that most young people do involve their parents in their decision to have an abortion.
And thank you for bringing that up, Ellie. I actually was the one that co-authored that report and that project. So I'm really happy to hear. I always love hearing that it is being put to use. And the findings from that report were very damning and frustrating. Same things are still continuing.
Yeah, well, thank you so much even more once again. That's very incredible. And thank you, Alexis, for putting that Floridians for Reproductive Freedom Judicial Bypass Toolkit in the chat. Everyone, please go take a look at that. Caroline, can you discuss any current or pending litigation in Florida involving these restrictions?
Sure. As I mentioned, I'm part of the team challenging Florida's 15-week abortion ban that Stephanie was just talking about a along with the ACLU of Florida, Planned Parenthood, and our pro bono partners, Jenner and Block. And we brought this case on behalf of a group of Florida abortion providers, including PPSWCF. Stephanie just, I think, did an amazing job laying out all of the harms of this ban. So I won't go into that, but the way it works is it criminalizes abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy by threatening healthcare providers with felony prosecution and imprisonment for providing the essential medical care to their patients that we were just talking about. The law is plainly unconstitutional under decades of established Florida law. So this is a case brought in Florida state court. In 1980, Florida amended its state constitution to provide an explicit right of privacy that is not found in the US Constitution. And in the decades since then, the Florida Supreme Court has consistently and repeatedly held that this right of privacy protects the right of Floridians to decide for themselves without government interference, whether to continue with a pregnancy or to have an abortion. Despite this clear unconstitutionality, though, the 15-week ban has been in effect since July 1, denying the right of people who can become pregnant their fundamental constitutional rights and putting patients in need of abortion care in harm's way. So like I said, we filed this case in state court. We filed in Leon County on June 1st, requesting a temporary injunction to block the law from going into effect. The trial court set a hearing for June 27th. So the day after Dobbs came down, I flew down to Tallahassee along with the rest of our team. And after a full day of evidentiary hearing, during which the court heard from multiple witnesses, the trial court did enter a temporary injunction, which should have worked to block the ban from going into effect. The court correctly found, based on the evidence and the law, that the 15-week ban is likely unconstitutional under Florida's constitution, and that it would cause immediate and irreparable harm to patients if it was allowed to take in effect. The state of Florida immediately appealed that ruling, which in Florida means appealing in this way triggers an automatic stay of the injunction under Florida law. So despite repeated efforts, the lower courts have refused to lift that automatic stay. So the temporary injunction never actually took effect. This means Florida's 15-week ban, which I should say is HB5, has been preventing patients from accessing the care they need for over 3 months now, forcing people to carry pregnancies against their will with the life-altering and life-threatening consequences we all know about. So where is the case now? On August 24th, the appellate court reversed the trial court, saying that the trial court was wrong to grant the temporary injunction. The next day, we filed a notice saying we intend to seek the Florida Supreme Court's discretionary jurisdiction to review that order. So that piece is still winding its way through the courts. And while the appeal of the temporary injunction has been proceeding, we also filed a notice in mid-August seeking the Florida Supreme Court's discretionary review of an intermediate court's decision refusing to reinstate the temporary injunction. So we filed an emergency motion. The state filed their brief on, I think, September 20th, and so that piece is now pending. So in short, what's happening is we're waiting on the Florida Supreme Court to weigh in on either the merits of the appeal of the temporary injunction or of the automatic stay of that temporary injunction. So yeah, we'll have to see. We're continuing to fight that case, but for now, it's sort of a waiting game to see what the Florida Supreme Court does.
Thank you, Caroline. So evidence demonstrates there is an inverse relationship between restrictive abortion policies and maternal health outcomes. The more abortion restrictions that a state has, the worse its maternal health outcomes tend to be, and the fewer number of evidence-based policies that support women and children it has enacted. These obstacles and barriers have the cumulative impact of denying care to patients and forcing health centers to close, and the inability to access a full range of reproductive healthcare services has a devastating and profound impact on individuals' well-being and life. Elise, can you discuss the correlation between abortion restrictions and maternal health outcomes, specifically for Black birthing people and people of color?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. So I think it is more important than ever that we place Black, Indigenous, and people of color at the forefront of our conversations about access to abortion and maternal health, because the reality is that pregnancy is or can be less safe for some of us than for others. And the cause of this is racism, not race. A persisting legacy of discrimination and unequal distribution of resources and inequitable access to care fall hardest on the most marginalized among us. And with white supremacist systems continuing to harm Black communities and an ongoing global pandemic whose impact is felt most, yet relief efforts are felt least by Black and Brown families, it's our job as advocates to have to continue to amplify the connections between the impact of abortion restrictions and what they have on overall health and the well-being of pregnant, capable people, and all the work that we do. So because of the heightened mortality and morbidity risks faced by Black pregnant, capable people, it is particularly unconscionable to force the continuation of an unwanted pregnancy. And in utilizing the reproductive justice framework, we know that restrictions on abortion care have far-reaching consequences, both deepening existing inequities and worsening health outcomes for pregnant and birthing people. And it's important to name that access to abortion care also benefits existing children and families, and most directly by allowing people to take on the cost of having children when they are best able to, or have the resources necessary to care and provide for the children that they already have. And studies like the Turnaway study, which is a longitudinal study examining the effects of unwanted pregnancy on women's lives, shows that pregnant people who are denied abortion care are worse off financially and significantly more likely to fall into poverty than people who are able to get the abortion care they need. And this further increases the disparities that women of color face and people of color face in the workplace and contributes to a widening of the wage gap. And then lastly, I'll say that the health risks associated with carrying a pregnancy, especially an unwanted pregnancy to term and through birth, are far higher. Studies have shown that pregnant people who are denied an abortion and gave birth reported more life-threatening complications like eclampsia and postpartum hemorrhage compared to those who have received wanted abortions. And so the disparate impact of mortality, morbidity, and mistreatment and abuse in the maternity care setting on Black people is directly correlated to the systemic barriers they face when accessing abortion care, and the root cause of both is racism. And our maternal healthcare system is failing to meet the mark, point blank, period. And that failure is intimately tied to Black people's lack of access to high quality, respectful, comprehensive reproductive health care, including abortion care. And the injustice of not being able to have control over one's own reproductive life and choices has a clear and detrimental effect on one's well-being and on their ability to thrive and participate fully in society, which stands in direct opposition to the values of reproductive justice.
Thank you so much, Elise. Data demonstrates that in nearly all aspects of reproductive health, Black women, Latino women, and women of color face poorer health outcomes and a rich history rooted in coercion and lack of bodily autonomy. Restrictions on healthcare and harmful legislation like those just discussed causes immense damage to those most vulnerable. Starting with Stephanie, can you all provide context on how historically communities of color have faced and continue to face persistent inequalities because of structural racism and discrimination across our healthcare system?
I think a great place to start that for me personally is really impactful is thinking about um, the forced sterilization and birth control trials of Puerto Rican women in the early 20th century, and how much that impact first that research of birth control, the birth control that was used on the Puerto Rican women was 50 times more potent than what is actually used today, right? And the long-term impacts of that on the health and well-being of the women and birthing people who used that obviously shifted the population, shifted the ability for people to grow their families at on their own timeline, and was really rooted in eugenics and white supremacy and trying to eliminate the Puerto Rican people from the island while using them as guinea pigs. And I think that um, the impact of something like of an event and of something like that, how that turns into right now. If you look at the statistics and especially in Puerto Rico, the use of a mostly permanent method of tubal ligation as the avenue for contraception. The rates, I can't remember what the specific statistic were, but they're higher than they would be out here, right? So when you're thinking about that long-term impact of like on the psyche and of the harm that it has on people's mind when they think about safe use of contraception. Like if you can't trust that the birth control that you're going to get is going to be safe and useful, then like why would you use it? And my matriarchs in my family don't trust birth control, and that's for a good reason because they were studied on. So I wanted to make sure to share that because that obviously to me as a Puerto Rican woman in 2022, I still feel the impact of that. And I see the impact of that on the women in my family. So I will pass it on to Elise to take it from here.
Sure. I think that, slavery as an institution and white supremacy as a framework have had a direct impact on the maternal mortality crisis among Black birthing people in the US. From the father of modern gynecology, Dr. J. Marion Sims, who famously performed countless experiments on Black women's bodies without anesthesia, on the basis that Black women could endure higher levels of pain than white women, is a direct reflection of the perception of Black women in our current healthcare system. And it feels clear that we're viewed as vessels of reproduction in this country. And with the recent ruling of Dobbs and the subsequent fallout and all the trigger bans and all the further restrictions that are coming down now, I think that only further bolsters that notion. From the many stories told by Black women today of the lack of respectful maternity care that they've received in their birthing experiences, as well as recent occurrences of forced sterilization of women in ICE detention centers. I think it was back in 2020. It's clear that the very systems in place that perpetuate harm are keeping the legacy of eugenics and population control well and alive today. And I think the thing to keep in mind is that because different groups of people have varying accesses to resources, birth outcomes are not equitable in nature. And we see this most clearly with maternal and infant health disparities, where income, wealth, education, and even insurance status are not protective factors for Black women and birthing people and pregnant capable people. And in fact, structural forces perpetuated by racist policies like slavery, the GI Bill, and Jim Crow created wealth for many white families and also created inequitable systems of housing and food stability, education, and access to care and safety, all of which have impacts on maternal health. and infant health. And it's important to understand that the disparities in health outcomes are manifestations of racism, which is the root cause of the maternal health disparities that we see today.
I would just add, again, turning back to the district court opinion in Dobbs, Judge Reeves really, I think, does an excellent job of digging into this, talking about how with the 15-week ban, Mississippi said, you know, this ban is necessary for the health of women. And the judge really, you know, refused to take that at face value and called that pure gaslighting, and analogized to Mississippi's sexist and racist history of discriminating against people, and specifically, you know, tied the current restrictions that we see today to instances of things like, I think he talked specifically about forced sterilization of Black women in a Mississippi county, and did a beautiful job of connecting it all together. And I would just say, you know, the statistic that always comes to my mind is that, you know, we know that the health system generally is racist and unjust, and BIPOC people have more difficulty accessing the care that they need across, you know, the entire spectrum of healthcare, and that is borne out in access to reproductive healthcare too, whether we're talking about abortions or, you know, more comprehensive reproductive healthcare. But the statistic that sticks out to me is that in Mississippi, it is 75 times more dangerous to continue a pregnancy to term than to have an abortion. And that number is even more stark for Black women. And so, you know, we're talking, of course, about very real harms that we are seeing play out today. So I'll leave it at that and pass back to Ellie.
Thank you all so much. Something I can add, a friend of mine recommended a book to me that speaks to some of the history of medical racism in our country. It's called Medical Bondage. And I haven't read it yet, but it's on my list. So if anyone wants to check that out. We know that abortion is a safe medication or a surgical procedure that's performed by trained and compassionate providers. However, we continue to see how unsafe pregnancy can be for people, specifically those who already experience systemic racism and mistreatment in our healthcare systems. The maternal health crisis in the US is deeply connected to the government's historic discrimination and neglect for marginalized communities. And we know that the maternal mortality rate in the US is the highest among developed countries. Can you all discuss the obstacles for obtaining maternal health care in Florida? And if you're able to speak to the legal fights against maternal health care racism and how these impact the ways in which we can provide healthcare in the future, then please do so. And we can start with Caroline.
Well, I actually will kick it to Elise and Stephanie because they, I think, are really more immersed in this. And so I can speak generally, but yeah, I think they'll be able to speak more to what's going on in Florida specifically.
Sure, I can start. So I'm going to answer your question eventually, but I first want to make a little plug. But so I mentioned at the top of the hour that our mission at NBEC is to foster community-centered collaboration, which is why we are big supporters of the community-based maternal health care model. And because they've proven time and time again to be promising models of care for low-income folks and communities of color specifically, they provide an alternative model of care delivery tailored to address maternal and infant health disparities, and they continue to demonstrate that culturally relevant services predicated on choice and autonomy and respect can improve maternal and infant health outcomes and have the potential to narrow the gap that we see in preterm birth and low birth rate. So I wanted to take a moment to highlight a Black-led community-based organization, or CBO, in Florida that's leading the charge in providing trauma-informed and life-saving wraparound support, Common Sense Childbirth, which is located in Winter Park, Florida, and is led by Jenny Joseph, who is a fantastic midwife and a great friend and partner of NBEC's. And Common Sense Childbirth was founded in 1998 and offers midwifery care, social service navigation, doula attendance at birth, childbirth education and lactation consultations, as well as standard prenatal care. And they even provide perinatal health worker training and certifications through their own online training program. So I think that we've touched a lot on the many obstacles that folks face in pursuit of obtaining quality maternal health care. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to highlight a model and an organization that is actively and successfully filling some of the gaps to move towards more equitable perinatal care.
I would like to lift up Southern Birth Justice Center, Southern Birth Justice in South Florida. They have full spectrum doulas, and their work is incredible. It is a Black woman-led organization, and I think it's important to, when we're talking about reproductive justice, to highlight and uplift organizations that are especially led by Black women to address like maternal mortality. And outside of just sharing that organization, when we're talking about the obstacles to obtaining maternal health care, we cannot ignore, again, Medicaid expansion and the lack of affordable health care in the state of Florida. I cannot remember the amount of funding that we get, but it is very low. It is one of the lowest in the country, lowest in the developed world, and that obviously for folks who are then forced to remain pregnant and who are lacking resources, then do not have access to perinatal care for very long. I will say that in Florida, ironically, one of the fastest ways to actually get Medicaid is to be pregnant. But within a few months after your pregnancy, that's it. And we know that the impact of childbirth is not just within the first 3 months after childbirth. We know that the care should continue for folks who are birthing people, who are continuing to potentially have children, who may want to have children in the future. They need healthcare too. And the way the system is set up in Florida, it just does not exist. So I will go ahead and pass it back.
Thank you all so much. Abortion restrictions can impact pregnant people's ability to access the maternal health care they need. With Roe being overturned, people who seek abortions, knowing it's not the right time for them to carry a pregnancy, are then they're forced to anyways. They now face risks of health complications. This includes people who want to carry pregnancies to term, but then miscarry, and they need care for that, but they're not able to get it. Also including people who have unexpected complications and need to end the pregnancy, as well as people who will be criminalized for behavior or outcomes of pregnancy. As we've discussed, these barriers will affect Black women, women of color more broadly, and people with disabilities. They've already long been subjected to reproductive coercion and denied reproductive autonomy in this country historically. Can you all expand on how we move forward without Roe? And I'll send it to Caroline first, since this is a legal question as well.
Sure. I mean, it's tough. We've all talked about, these bans are having a devastating impact on access to care across the spectrum of reproductive health care. We're already seeing that, folks who can travel out of state, thinking in Florida specifically, folks who are past 15 weeks, those who can travel out of state, will try to do so. They're facing barriers in other states, especially as there's more congestion when people from banned states are, going to the same states where there still is access. But we know that many people aren't going to be able to just pick up and go out of state. And so we're seeing a lot of harm already. I will say something that I've really seen coming out a lot is that people are being denied access to care like miscarriage management treatment, and ectopic pregnancy treatment and various forms of healthcare, because, surprise, abortion care is related, and it's just one piece of comprehensive healthcare, which is something we've known all along. But I think people are starting to realize this and are starting to see how these connections play out, and the impact that it does have on other forms of reproductive health care when you do ban abortion. People are realizing, for instance, that the types of medication or the procedure you might get for a miscarriage is the exact same treatment or medication you could get if you were seeking an abortion. So I've already heard countless stories about this in Louisiana specifically. For instance, that case I mentioned, we submitted, I think it was 15 plus affidavits from a patient, from a certified nurse midwife, and doctors practicing in oncology, family medicine, emergency room doctors, all talking about how banning abortion is impacting their ability to provide these other forms of care. And I think we're going to continue to see this. So, I mean, in thinking about, what do we do? How do we move forward? I think we keep fighting, and I think we keep talking. I think we're going to see more stories like this come out, where people are being denied care that they wouldn't have expected would be impacted by abortion bans. My hope is that as we see these stories, as terrible as they are, these stories will start to help to break down silos, and break down the stigma of care. And my hope is that in the long term, this will contribute to maybe a broader understanding of reproductive health care and what it means to have access to necessary health care. But I think it's really tough. So I'll leave it at that.
I just want to add that many folks have already been surviving without Roe for a long time, especially in communities where abortion has become inaccessible completely, in states where there was already only one abortion clinic, because of the many abortion restrictions that have been enacted on the state level. So in those communities, many folks are leaning into community care and into mutual aid. And I encourage folks who, if you want to provide a different type of support, support that is tangible and happens kind of right away, is leaning into that community support and mutual aid, which is through abortion funding organizations. Go to abortionfunds.org. You can find your local abortion fund. There is a clinic defense. You can escort in front of local abortion clinics to ensure that patients feel safe and supported when going in. In Florida specifically, there needs to be more lawyers who are trained to provide judicial bypass support, leaning into CLEs where you can learn about that. And touching on criminalization, if there's a commitment from the elected officials or the folks who would authorize the criminalization of folks, then making an appeal to those folks, getting a commitment from your local prosecutors, from local law enforcement to say, like, we're not going to criminalize people who are reported for ending their own pregnancies. We can't have criminalization without folks implementing that criminalization. So I want to make sure to highlight that as well, as a tool that could potentially also be used. And aside from that, obviously, challenging abortion stigma. That's how we can get past surviving past Roe. We're already surviving past Roe. We've all been surviving past Roe. And I think it's time to think beyond Roe, and to think about comprehensive policies that don't hinge on a Supreme Court decision to ensure that we have access to our bodily autonomy.
Totally agree, Stephanie. And I'll just add, to state the obvious, that sex, pregnancy, and birth are not going to stop in the face of abortion restrictions. And the ripple effect of overturning Roe has and will put a huge strain on an already failing maternity healthcare system. And so we have to get creative at the federal level, which is primarily the work that I focus on. We've been working really closely with the Biden administration, who's been very engaged with advocates in the repro, health rights, and justice space. They've had and have publicly committed to using they call it the whole of government approach, to protect and expand access to abortion care. And it's really great that they're now saying abortion out loud. It took them a long time, but better late than never, I guess. And to date, they pushed out a lot of executive orders providing clarifying guidance, that the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, EMTALA, includes abortion services, which was, of course, immediately challenged in the courts and, by the usual state objectors. But the admin has also directed HHS to issue further guidance to pharmacies to clarify their role to fill medication abortion, contraception, and other prescriptions. And I think it was end of August, Secretary Becerra and CMS Administrator Brooks LaSure sent a letter to governors as well as CMS directors, inviting them to submit 1115 waivers to expand access to care to individuals traveling from states that have banned or restricted abortion care. So those are some of the levers at the federal level that are being pulled. The messages and the emphasis continues to be that it's going to take all of us, the advocates, the lawyers, the providers, and the patients, to think creatively to reimagine what access to care looks like, and to begin to undo the damage that, we also have to keep in mind. It took us 50 years to get to this point, so it's going to take a while to undo, but we all have to be committed to being in it for the long haul.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. One thing I've said probably for the last at least year is that Roe was the floor, not the ceiling. There's many other things that we can do. And we've already been dipping our toes into our final question, what the various tools are that could be used to combat these barriers. If there's any that you think we did not discuss that you would like to add and discuss, then feel free.
Sure, I can chime in unless Stephanie wants to add anything before she hops off. Otherwise, I can go ahead.
A tool that I want to lift up is our love and our compassion and support for each other. Our stories are super impactful and important, and we should share them safely and often and with anybody and everybody who will hear. It's also important to push back on abortion stigma and abortion misinformation. I think using that reporting tool on social media, informing that, like, this is wrong, this is incorrect. Also, like, commenting and sharing with folks who we love and folks who we care about, and challenging folks to think further and beyond. Of this is not just about abortion access, this is about reproductive justice. This impacts everybody, even folks who cannot get pregnant, right? So that's that's the tool I want to continue to highlight and use. Like we can use, we have ourselves, and we can fight for our bodily autonomy and abortion access and liberation and all of those things ourselves. So that's my call to action. And like I said, I have to hop off, but it's been such a pleasure sharing space with everybody. And I dropped my email in the chat if anybody wants to reach out to me through Florida Access Network and Abortion Fund. You have my email. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Stephanie.
So I can tack on to what Stephanie said. So I think it's exactly right. Telling stories, fighting stigma. I think generally spurring state and local and national conversations is huge. I mentioned the affidavits we submitted in Louisiana, and I just want to emphasize that, people have really come out of the woodwork. I've been litigating in Louisiana with the center for now about 5 or 6 years, and we do not usually see this level of support. But people have really stood up, both providers, a patient wanting to tell their story, multiple patients telling their stories in different ways. And also we had law professors from every single one of the Louisiana law schools submit an amicus brief in support of, it was very technical, but in support of essentially reinstating the preliminary injunction in that case, which again, we just don't usually, we're not used to seeing. So I think these conversations are happening, and if we can continue to, encourage them to happen, I do think that that will have a large impact. I think organizing to hold the line on what protections are there, it is absolutely right. Roe was a floor. And, I think, like I said at the top, legal rights are huge, but, they are not what's going to ensure access all by themselves. But I think things like the Kansas ballot initiative, fighting. So I should back up. So Kansas has recognized the right to abortion under their state constitution through ongoing litigation in a case that's actually still live. But there was an initiative to amend the Constitution to roll back that right, and that initiative failed. So, there was a lot of work done on that and to fight that initiative. So I think work like that is also very important. And then finally, I think championing laws like the Women's Health Protection Act is helpful to block many of these restrictions. WIPA, or the Women's Health Protection Act, is a federal bill that would provide independent statutory protection for the right to access abortion care and would prohibit medically unnecessary abortion restrictions. So the bill did not pass this year, but it passed in the House and was called for a historic floor vote in the Senate, and that was before Dobbs. So I think, continued work on things like that too is another way to shore up some of those legal rights as well.
And I just add to that and echo all of those things, but add lifting up and continuing to donate to abortion funds and community-based orgs, continuing to be creative and increasing access to medication abortion, emergency contraception, and expanding access to over-the-counter oral contraception, which is something that NBEC has been working on recently. We're also continuing to advocate and push decision makers to strengthen state level abortion protections for providers and patients, and particularly folks on Medicaid, and as well as pushing for the extension of most Medicaid postpartum coverage. And of course, the Black Maternal Health Momnibus package that is currently stuck in the Senate and hopefully will make its way through in the spending package. But there's a lot of good legislation out there in the works.
Thank you all so much. I'm gonna turn it over to Alexis if there are any questions in the chat for our Q&A segment.
Awesome. Yes, thank you all so much. It's incredible the knowledge you have, the passion you have. And it was such a pleasure to listen to you and learn not only about, the landscape that we have going on, but what we can do. As the first thing that I was thinking as a lawyer who doesn't necessarily practice, in this field, in this world, but the burning question on my mind was, what can I do? How can I obviously vote? Obviously, get out there, obviously, share my opinions and my thoughts. And I think all of the resources that you all provided really made me feel empowered to know that I can be a part in some way, the way that I can. So I did want to say that somebody did not a question we actually were able to answer. It looked like all the questions that came through as they did. Hint for any folks listening in if they want to drop any questions in now. Somebody did mention another organization that I just wanted to give a shout out to as well. It was from Andrea, and it is the Aid and Abet Abortion Organization, and that is actually a resource for organizing in Florida. So for folks that want to get their boots on the ground and do community organizing, there's a resource for you all. No questions, no other questions have come through, at this moment in time. So I don't know if there was anything else that you all wanted to touch on. I know you've been talking lots. Was there any other topic that you wanted to expand upon that maybe we didn't have enough time to already?
I can add some additional thoughts that came to mind just with what you were saying, Alexis, about like thinking about what to do as an attorney. If there are other lawyers out there who want to get involved, we frequently work with partners on amicus briefs. So these are like friend of the court briefs. And that is very helpful. Like I mentioned, the law professors coming in, is fantastic. And storytelling is really crucial now. And we often, the center, when we litigate, we often work with partners. Sometimes that's litigating organizations like I mentioned, the ACLU, the Lawyering Project, Planned Parenthood. And also we work with firms in a pro bono capacity and partner on these cases. So like I said, Jenner is a partner in the Florida case. And, it's really helpful to have partners like that who are ready to jump into the fight and assist with these cases, because it is a battle. And, some of these cases go on years and years and are really difficult. And so it's great to have partners in that fight.
On that note, what is the best way for folks, for attorneys to get involved on a pro bono level? Is there a coordinator that you all have or some particular way of getting in contact?
I might kick that to other people at the center to drop their suggestions in the chat, because we do have a pro bono department who does help coordinate all of that work. And we also have a lawyers network that is fantastic. And I'm not sure off the top of my head who would be best to connect them with. So people can either drop that into the chat or reach out to us and we'll connect you to the right people.
Awesome. Thank you. I know folks would really appreciate that. And did I cut you off? I know you were in the middle of going to something next before I asked about how to get connected.
I was just going to echo, always give to the funds and people, helping pregnant people get access to the care they need. And just to say, I do think, the next year and the years beyond are going to be really hard. There's no real way to sugarcoat that. But I think it's important to remember that we are the majority, that polls show broad support for abortion and reproductive autonomy. And so, I think this is a long fight and there's plenty of work to do, but I'm confident that, with time we will have success and be able to, expand access and rights again.
Time and a lot of perseverance. So I know Christy, who commented in the chat, she said, thank you to all the panelists. What a great wealth of information. And she used the word right, bravery you shared, for sharing today and what you shared today. So, with that being said, Elise, was there something that you wanted to also add now that we have a little more time?
I'll just quickly share my closing remark would just be, we need to continue, midterms are coming up really, really soon. And I think we need to continue to work to elect, appoint, and confirm officials who are aligned not just with pro-choice values, but to go beyond that, and make sure that we're electing people that align with reproductive justice values. And I think it's our duty to hold everyone accountable, our elected officials accountable at every level, every day, because our lives depend on it.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. So, with that being said, we won't keep you any longer. I'm sure you all have plenty of things that you need to do and get to. And I know on behalf of the legal aid community and the legal community in Florida, we thank you so much for the time that you've given us today, for the incredible work that you do. We'll certainly be watching as you fight and, fighting alongside of you in the capacities that we can. And with that, I don't know if Ellie, you wanted to say any last thing. And if so, the CLE information. I'm not even thinking about that. I'm thinking about everything else that we discussed. Let me drop that in the chat while we have a few more moments. And if you want to say anything, Ellie, while I'm doing that, please feel free.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you all once again to our attendees and to our amazing panelists. I know I have learned so much today, and it was great to connect with you all. And for anyone looking to take action, get involved, especially at the local level, whether it's local government or grassroots organizing. It is tough work, but it is needed and extremely rewarding and beneficial.
Absolutely. And so I just dropped the information into the chat. This training session was approved by the Florida Bar for 1 general CLE credit. The CLE code is 2208051, N as in Nancy. You will receive an email from Zoom in 24 hours with that CLE code and a copy of this recording. So don't worry if you missed something. Don't worry if you can't jot it down fast enough. If you missed that in your inbox, my email address is in the chat. It's alexis.alvarez@floridalegal.org. Please feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, if you need anything, any future training ideas, or if there's anything, feel free to reach out. And with that being said, thank you very much for your time, for being in community with us, for teaching us, and everything that you do. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.